Ireland. August 1983, March 1984. Summer and autumn. "I want to learn about magic," said the girl. The magus looked at her. Faded jeans, t-shirt, the challenging look adopted by all shy people precisely when it's least needed. I must be twice her age, he thought. And despite this, he knew that he had met his soulmate. "My name's Brida," she went on. "Forgive me for not introducing myself. I've waited a long time for this moment, and I'm more nervous than I thought I would be." "Why do you want to learn about magic?" he asked. "So that I can find answers to some of the questions I have regarding life, so that I can learn about the occult powers, and possibly how to travel back into the past and forward into the future." It wasn't the first time someone had come to the forest to ask him this. There was a time when he'd been a teacher who was known and respected by the tradition. He'd taken on several pupils and believed that the world would change if he could change those around him. But he had made a mistake. And teachers of the tradition cannot make mistakes. "Don't you think you're rather young?" "I'm 21, said Brida. "If I wanted to start learning ballet, I'd be considered too old." The magus made a sign for her to follow him. They set off together through the forest in silence. "She's pretty," he was thinking as the shadows cast by the trees rapidly lengthened and shifted as the sun sank lower on the horizon. "But I'm twice her age." This, he knew, meant that he might well suffer. Brida felt irritated by the silence of the man walking beside her. He hadn't even deigned to respond to her last remark. The forest floor was wet and covered in fallen leaves. She, too, noticed the shadows changing and the rapid approach of night. It would be dark soon, and they didn't have a flashlight with them. "I have to trust him," she told herself. "If I believe that he can teach me magic, then I also have to believe that he can guide me through the forest." They continued walking. He appeared to be wandering aimlessly from one side to the other, changing direction even when there was no obstacle in his path. More than once they walked in a circle, passing the same place 3 or 4 times. "Perhaps he's testing me." She was determined to see this experience through to the end, and tried telling herself that everything that was happening, including those circular walks, was perfectly normal. She had come a very long way and had hoped for more from this encounter. Dublin was over 90 miles away, and the buses to the village were uncomfortable and left at absurd times. She had to get up early, travel for 3 hours, ask the people in the village where she might find him, and explain what she wanted with such a strange man. Finally, someone had told her in which part of the forest he could usually be found during the day, but not without first warning her that he'd already tried to seduce one of the village girls. "He's an interesting man," she thought to herself. They were climbing now, and she found herself hoping that the sun would linger a little longer in the sky. She was afraid she might slip on the damp leaves. "Why do you really want to learn about magic?" Brida was pleased that the silence had been broken. She gave him the same answer she had given before. But he wasn't satisfied. "Perhaps you want to learn about magic because it's mysterious and secret, because it provides answers that few human beings ever manage to find in a whole lifetime, or perhaps because it evokes a romantic past." Brida said nothing. She didn't know what to say. Afraid to give an answer the magus might not like, she rather wished he would lapse back into his earlier silence. At last they came to the top of a hill, having crossed the entire forest. The ground there was rocky and bare of vegetation, but at least it was less slippery, and Brida could follow the magus without difficulty. He sat down on the highest point and asked Brida to do the same. "Other people have been here before," said the magus. "They, too, came to ask me to teach them about magic, but I've taught everything I needed to teach. I've given back to humanity what it gave to me. Now I want to be alone, to climb mountains, tend plants, and commune with God." "That's not true," replied the girl. "What isn't true?" he asked, surprised. "You might want to commune with God, but it isn't true that you want to be alone." Brida regretted having spoken. She had spoken on an impulse, and now it was too late to correct her mistake. Perhaps there were people who wanted to be alone. Perhaps women needed men more than men needed women. The magus, however, showed no sign of irritation when he spoke again. "I'm going to ask you a question," he said, "and you must be absolutely honest in your answer. If you tell me the truth, I'll teach you what you ask. If you lie, you must never again return to this forest." Brida gave a sigh of relief. He was going to ask her a question. She simply had to tell the truth, that was all. She had always assumed that a teacher would demand really difficult things of someone before taking them on as a pupil. "Let's suppose that I do start teaching you what I've learned," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Let's suppose that I start to show you the parallel universes that surround us, the angels, the wisdom of nature, the mysteries of the tradition of the sun and the tradition of the moon. Then one day you go into town to buy some food, and in the middle of the street you meet the love of your life." I wouldn't know how to recognize him, she thought, but decided to say nothing. This question was turning out to be more difficult than she'd imagined. He feels the same and comes over to you. You fall in love with each other. You continue your studies with me. During the day, I teach you the wisdom of the cosmos, and at night, he teaches you the wisdom of love. But there comes a moment when those two things can no longer coexist, and you have to choose. The magus paused for a few seconds. Before he actually asked the question, he felt afraid of what the girl's reply might be. Her coming there that evening meant the end of a stage in both their lives. He knew this because he understood the traditions and intentions of teachers. He needed her as much as she needed him, but she had to answer the question he put to her truthfully. That was the sole condition. "Now answer this question with total honesty," he said at last, screwing up his courage. "Mysteries that the world of magic could offer you. In order to stay with the love of would you give up everything you had learned until then? All the possibilities and all the life?" Brida looked away. Around her lay the mountains and the forests, and down below, the lights in the village were beginning to come on. Soon, families would be gathering around the table to have supper. They worked hard and honestly, they feared God, and they tried to help their fellow man. They did all these things because they had known love. Their lives had a reason. They could understand everything that was going on in the universe without ever having heard of things like the tradition of the sun and the tradition of the moon. "I see no contradiction between my search and my personal happiness," she said. "Answer my question." His eyes were still fixed on hers. "Would you give up everything for that man?" Brida felt a tremendous urge to cry. It wasn't so much a question, it was a choice, the most difficult choice anyone would have to make in life. It was something she'd already thought about a lot. There had been a time when nothing in the world was as important as herself. She'd had several boyfriends and had always believed that she loved each one, only to see love vanish from one moment to the next. Of all the things she'd experienced until then, love had been the most difficult. Just then, she was in love with someone slightly older than herself. He was studying physics and had a completely different vision of the world from hers. Once again, she was putting her belief in love, trusting her feelings, but she'd been disappointed so often before that she was no longer sure of anything. Nevertheless, this was the great gamble of her life. She continued to avoid the magus's gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the village and its twinkling lights. People had been trying to understand the universe through love ever since the beginning of time. "I'd give it all up," she said at last. The man standing before her, she thought, would never understand what went on in people's hearts. He was a man who knew the power and the mystery of magic, but he didn't know people. His hair was grizzled, his skin burned by the sun, and he had the physique of someone used to walking in the mountains. He was so very attractive, with eyes that revealed a soul full of answers, and he would once again be disappointed by the feelings of ordinary human beings. She was disappointed with herself, too, but she couldn't lie. "Look at me," said the magus. Brida felt ashamed, but did as he asked. "You told the truth. I will be your teacher." Darkness fell, and the stars were shining in a moonless sky. It took 2 hours for Brida to tell the stranger her life story. She tried to look for facts that would explain her interest in magic, childhood visions, premonitions, and inner calling, but could find nothing. She simply felt a need to know, that was all. And because of that, she had taken courses in astrology, tarot, and numerology. "Those are merely languages," said the magus, "and they're not the only ones. Magic speaks all the languages of the human heart." "So what is magic?" she asked. Even in the darkness, Brida could sense that the magus had turned away from her. He was looking up at the sky, absorbed in thought, perhaps in search of an answer. "Magic is a bridge," he said at last, "a bridge that allows you to walk from the visible world over into the invisible world and to learn the lessons of both those worlds." "And how can I learn to cross that bridge?" "By discovering your own way of crossing it. Everyone has their own way." "That's what I came here to find out." "There are 2 forms," replied the magus. "The tradition of the sun, which teaches the secrets through space and the world that surrounds us, and the tradition of the moon, which teaches through time and the things that are imprisoned in time's memory." Brida had understood. The tradition of the sun was the night, the trees, the cold gripping her body, the stars in the sky. And the tradition of the moon was that man before her now, with the wisdom of the ancestors shining in his eyes. "I learned the tradition of the moon," said the magus, as if he could read her thoughts, "but I was never a teacher of that tradition. I am a teacher of the tradition of the sun." "Teach me the tradition of the sun, then," said Brida, feeling slightly disconcerted, for she had sensed a note of tenderness in the magus's voice. "I will teach you what I have learned, but the tradition of the sun has many roads. One must trust in each person's ability to teach him or herself." Brida was right. There was a note of tenderness in the magus's voice. Far from reassuring her, this frightened her. "I know I am capable of understanding the tradition of the sun," she said. The magus stopped gazing up at the stars and concentrated on the young woman. He knew that she was not quite ready to learn the tradition of the sun, and yet he must teach it to her. Some peoples choose their teachers. "Before our first lesson, I want to remind you of one thing," he said. "When you find your path, you must not be afraid. You need to have sufficient courage to make mistakes. Disappointment, defeat, and despair are the tools God uses to show us the way." "Strange tools," said Brida. "They often dissuade people from carrying on." The magus knew the reason for these tools. He had already experienced both in body and soul. "Teach me the tradition of the sun," she insisted. The magus asked Brida to lean back against the rock and relax. "There's no need to close your eyes. Look at the world around you and try to see and understand as much as you can. The tradition of the sun is constantly revealing eternal knowledge to each individual." Brida did as the magus told her to, but she felt he was moving much too fast. "This is the first and most important lesson," he said. "It was created by a Spanish mystic who understood the meaning of faith. His name was Street John of the Cross." He looked at the girl's eager, trusting face. In his heart, he prayed she would understand what he had to teach her. She was, after all, his soul mate, even if she didn't yet know it, even if she was still very young and fascinated by the things and the people of this world. In the darkness, Brida could just make out the shape of the magus going back into the forest and disappearing among the trees to her left. She was afraid of being left there alone, but tried to remain relaxed. This was her first lesson, and she must not show that she was nervous. He accepted me as his pupil. I can't disappoint him. She was pleased with herself and, at the same time, surprised at how quickly it had all happened. Not that she had ever doubted her abilities. She was proud of herself and of what had brought her there. She was sure that the Magus was somewhere nearby, watching her reactions, to see if she was capable of learning the first lesson of magic. He had spoken of courage, and so even if she felt afraid, images of the snakes and scorpions that might be living underneath that rock began to rise up from the depths of her imagination. She must be brave. In a while, he would return to teach her the first lesson. "I'm a strong, determined woman," she repeated to herself under her breath. She was privileged to be there with that man whom other people either loved or feared. She looked back on the evening they had just spent together and recalled the moment when she had sensed a certain tenderness in his voice. Perhaps he found me interesting. Perhaps he even wanted to make love with me. It wouldn't be a bad experience. There was, however, a strange look in his eyes. What an idiotic thing to think. There she was, in search of something very real, a path to knowledge, and suddenly she was thinking of herself as a mere woman. She tried not to think about it again, and it was then that she realized how much time had passed since the Magus had left her alone. She felt the beginnings of panic. She had heard contradictory views about that man. Some said he was the most powerful teacher they'd ever met, capable of changing the direction of the wind, of piercing the clouds, purely by the power of thought. And Brida was as fascinated as everyone else by such prodigies. Other people, though, people on the fringes of the world of magic, who attended the same courses and classes as she did, assured her that he was a black magician and had once used his powers to destroy a man because he had fallen in love with the man's wife. And this was why, even though he was a teacher, he had been condemned to wander the lonely forests. Perhaps solitude has made his madness worse, Brida thought, and again she felt the first stirrings of panic. She may have been young, but she knew the harm that loneliness could do to people, especially as they got older. She had met people who had lost the glow of being alive because they could no longer fight against loneliness and had ended up becoming addicted to it. They were, for the most part, people who believed the world to be an undignified, inglorious place, and who spent their evenings and nights talking on and on about the mistakes others had made. They were people whom solitude had made into the judges of the world, whose verdicts were scattered to the four winds for whoever cared to listen. Perhaps the Magus had gone mad with loneliness. A sudden noise nearby made her jump, and her heart raced. All trace of her earlier confidence vanished. She looked around. Nothing. A wave of terror seemed to rise up from her belly and spread through her body. I must get a grip on myself, she thought, but it was impossible. Images of snakes and scorpions and childhood ghosts began to appear before her. Brida was too terrified to stay calm. Another image arose, that of a powerful magician who had made a pact with the devil and was offering her up as a sacrifice. "Where are you?" she cried. She didn't care now what impression she made on anyone. She simply wanted to get out of there. No one answered. "I want to get out of here. Help me." There was only the forest and its strange noises. Brida felt so dizzy with fear, she thought she might faint. But she mustn't. Now that she was quite sure he was nowhere around, fainting certainly wouldn't help matters. She must stay in control. This thought made her aware that there was some part of her struggling to maintain control. "I mustn't call out," she said to herself. Her shouts could attract other men who lived in that forest, and men who live in forests can be more dangerous than any wild animal. "I have faith," she started to say softly. I have faith in God, faith in my guardian angel who brought me here and who remains here with me. I can't explain what he's like, but I know he is near. I will not dash my foot against a stone." These last words were from a psalm she had learned as a child, and which she hadn't thought about for years. She had been taught the psalm by her grandmother, who had died quite recently. As soon as she wished her grandmother could be there, she immediately felt a friendly presence. She was beginning to understand that there was a big difference between danger and fear. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High." That was how the psalm began. She realized that it was all coming back to her word for word, exactly as if her grandmother were reciting it to her now. She kept reciting for some time, without stopping, and despite her fear, she felt calmer. She had no choice. Either she believed in God, in her guardian angel, or she despaired. She felt a protective presence. "I need to believe in this presence. I don't know how to explain it, but it exists, and it will stay with me all night, because I don't know how to find my way out of here alone." When she was a child, she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, feeling terrified. Her father would carry her to the window and show her the town where they lived. He would talk to her about the night watchman, about the milkman who would already be out delivering the milk, about the baker making their daily bread. Her father was trying to drive out the monsters with which she'd filled the night and replace them with the people who kept watch over the darkness. "The night is just a part of the day," he would say. "The night is just a part of the day." Therefore she could feel as safe in the dark as she did in the light. It was the dark that had made her invoke that protective presence. She must trust it. And that trust was called faith. No one could ever understand faith, but faith was what she was experiencing now, an inexplicable immersion in blackest night. It only existed because she believed in it. Miracles couldn't be explained either, but they existed for those who believed in them. He did say something about the first lesson, she thought, suddenly realizing what was going on. The protective presence was there because she believed in it. Brida began to feel the fatigue of so many hours under tension. She began to relax again, and with each moment that passed, she felt more protected. She had faith, and faith wouldn't allow the forest to be peopled again with scorpions and snakes. Faith would keep her guardian angel awake and watching. She leaned back against the rock again, and all unknowing, fell asleep. It was light when she woke, and a beautiful sun was gilding everything around her. She felt a little cold, her clothes were grubby, but her soul was rejoicing. She had spent the whole night alone in a forest. She looked everywhere for the Magus, knowing that she would not find him. He must be walking in the forest somewhere trying to commune with God, and perhaps wondering if the girl who'd come to see him the previous night had sufficient courage to learn the first lesson of the tradition of the sun. "I learned about the dark night," she said to the now silent forest. "I learned that the search for God is a dark night, that faith is a dark night. And that's hardly a surprise really, because for us each day is a dark night. None of us knows what might happen even the next minute, and yet still we go forward, because we trust, because we have faith. Or, who knows, perhaps because we just don't see the mystery contained in the next second. Not that it mattered. What mattered was knowing that she had understood. That every moment in life is an act of faith. That you could choose to fill it with snakes and scorpions or with a strong protecting force. That faith cannot be explained. It was simply a dark night, and all she had to do was to accept it or not. Brida looked at her watch and saw that it was getting late. She had to catch a bus, travel for 3 hours, and think up some convincing excuse to give her boyfriend. He would never believe she had spent the whole night alone in a forest. "It's a very difficult thing, the tradition of the sun," she shouted to the forest. "I have to be my own teacher, and that isn't what I was expecting." She looked at the village down below, mentally traced her path back through the woods, and set off. First, though, she turned to the rock again. In a loud, joyous voice, she cried, "There's one other thing. You're a very interesting man." Leaning against the trunk of an old tree, the Magus watched the girl vanish into the woods. He had listened to her fears and heard her cries during the night. At one point, he had even been tempted to go over and embrace her, to shield her from her terror, saying that she didn't need this kind of challenge. Now he was pleased that he hadn't, and he felt proud that the girl, in all her youthful confusion, was his soul mate. In the center of Dublin, there is a bookshop that specializes in occult studies. It has never advertised in newspapers or magazines, and the people who go there do so on the recommendation of others. The owner is glad to have such a select, specialist clientele. Even so, the bookshop is always full. Brida had heard about it and finally managed to get the address from the person teaching the course on astral travel she was currently attending. She went there late one afternoon after work and was delighted with the place. From then on, whenever she could, she would go there to look at the books, but she never bought any because they were all imported and very expensive. She would leaf through them, studying the designs and symbols in some of the books, and intuitively tuning into the vibration of all that accumulated knowledge. She had grown more cautious since her experience with the Magus. Sometimes she would bemoan to herself the fact that she only managed to take part in things she could already understand. She sensed that she was missing out on something very important in life, and that if she carried on as she was, she would simply continue to repeat the same experiences over and over. And yet she didn't have the courage to change. She needed to be constantly struggling to discover her path. Now that she had experienced the dark night, she knew that she didn't want to find her way through it. And although she was sometimes dissatisfied with herself, she felt unable to go beyond her own limitations. Books were safer. The shelves contained reprints of treatises written hundreds of years ago. It was an area in which very few people dared to say anything new. And in the pages of these books, occult knowledge, distant and remote, seemed to smile at the efforts made by each generation to uncover it. Apart from looking at the books, Brida had another important reason for going to the shop: to observe the other customers. Sometimes she would pretend to be reading some respectable alchemical treatise, when she was, in fact, scrutinizing the men and women, usually older than she, who frequented the shop and who knew what they wanted and always went to the right shelf. She tried to imagine what they must be like in private. Some looked very wise, capable of awakening forces and powers of which mere mortals knew nothing. Others appeared to be desperately trying to rediscover answers they had long ago forgotten, but without which life had no meaning. She noticed, too, that the most regular customers always had a word with the owner. They talked about strange things, such as the phases of the moon, the properties of stones, and the correct pronunciation of ritual words. One afternoon, Brida got up sufficient courage to do the same. She was on her way back from work, on a day when everything had gone well. She thought she should make the most of that good luck. "I know that there are secret societies," she said. She thought this a good conversational opener. She knew something. But the owner merely looked up from his accounts and stared at her in amazement. "I was with the Magus in Folk," said Brida, rather put out now, and not knowing quite how to continue. "He explained to me about the dark night. He told me that the path of wisdom means not being afraid to make mistakes." She noticed that the owner was listening more intently now. If the Magus had bothered to teach her something, she must be special. "If you know that the dark night is the path, why do you need books?" he said at last, and she knew that mentioning the Magus had not been a good idea. "Because that isn't the way I want to learn," she said. The owner looked more closely at the young woman standing before him. While she clearly had a gift, it was nevertheless odd that the Magus of Folk should have devoted so much time to her. There must be something else. She could be lying, but then again she had spoken of the dark night. "You often come here," he said. "You arrive, read a few books, but never buy anything." "They're too expensive," said Brida, sensing that he wanted to continue the conversation. "But I've read other books and I've attended courses." She told him the names of her teachers, hoping to impress him still more. Again things did not go quite as she expected. The owner interrupted her and went to serve another customer who wanted to know if the book he'd ordered had come in, an almanac containing the planetary positions for the next 100 years. The owner examined various packages stored underneath the counter. Brida saw that the packages bore stamps from all corners of the world. She was getting more and more nervous. Her initial courage had vanished completely, but she had no option but to wait for the other customer to check that it was the right book, pay for it, receive his change, and leave. Only then did the owner turn to her again. "I don't know how to continue," said Brida. Her eyes were beginning to fill with tears. "What are you good at?" asked the owner. "Going after what I believe in." That was the only possible reply. She had spent her life in pursuit of what she believed in. The only problem was that she believed in something different every day. The owner wrote a name on the sheet of paper on which he was doing his accounts, tore off the piece he had written on, and held it for a moment in his hand. "I'm going to give you an address," he said. There was a time when people accepted magical experiences as natural. There were no priests then, and no one went chasing after the secrets of the occult. Brida wasn't sure whether he was referring to her or not. "Do you know what magic is?" he asked. "It's a bridge between the visible world and the invisible world." The owner gave her the piece of paper. On it was a phone number and a name, Wicca. Brida snatched the paper from him, thanked him, and left. When she reached the door, she turned and said, "I also know that magic speaks many languages, even the language of booksellers who pretend to be unhelpful, but are, in fact, very generous and approachable." She blew him a kiss and disappeared. The bookseller paused over his accounts and stood looking at his shop. The Magus of Folk taught her those things, he thought. A gift, however good, wasn't reason enough for the Magus to take such an interest. There must be some other motive. Wicca would find it out. It was time to close the shop. The bookseller had noticed lately that his clientele was starting to change. It was becoming younger. As the old treatises crowding his shelves predicted, things were finally beginning to return to the place from whence they came. The old building was in the center of town, in a place that is now only visited by tourists in search of a little 19th century romanticism. Brida had had to wait a week before Wicca would agree to see her, and now she was standing outside a mysterious gray building, struggling to contain her excitement. That building was exactly as she'd imagined it would be. It was just the kind of place where the type of person who visited the bookshop should live. There was no elevator. She went up the stairs slowly so as not to be out of breath when she reached the floor she wanted, and when she arrived, she rang the bell of the only door there. Inside, a dog barked. Then, after a brief delay, a slim, elegant, serious-looking woman opened the door. "I phoned earlier," said Brida. Wicca indicated that she should come in, and Brida found herself in a living room entirely painted in white and with examples of modern art everywhere, with paintings on the walls and sculptures and vases on the tables. The light from outside was filtered through white curtains. The room was cleverly divided into different areas to accommodate sofas, a dining table, and a well-stocked library. Everything was in the very best taste and reminded Brida of the architecture and design magazines she used to look at on the newsstands. It must have cost a fortune, she thought. Wicca led Brida into the vast living room, into an area furnished by 2 Italian armchairs in leather and steel. Between the 2 chairs was a low glass table with steel legs. "You're very young," said Wicca at last. There was little point in making her usual comment about ballerinas, and so Brida said nothing, waiting to hear what the woman would say next, and meanwhile wondering what such a modern design was doing inside an old building like that. Her romantic idea of the search for knowledge had once again been shaken. "He phoned me," Wicca said, and Brida understood that she was referring to the bookseller. "I came in search of a teacher. I want to follow the road of magic." Wicca looked at Brida. She clearly possessed a gift, but she needed to know why the Magus of Folk had been so interested in her. The gift on its own was not enough. If the Magus had been new to magic, he might have been impressed by the clarity with which the gift manifested itself in the young woman, but he had lived long enough to know that everyone possesses a gift. He was wise to such traps. She got up, went over to one of the bookshelves, and picked up her favorite deck of cards. "Do you know how to lay the cards?" she asked. Brida nodded. She had done a few courses and knew that the deck in the woman's hand was a tarot deck with 78 cards. She had learned various ways of laying out the tarot and was glad to have a chance to show off her knowledge. However, the woman kept hold of the deck. She shuffled the cards, then placed them face down, in no particular order, in the glass table. This was a method quite unlike any Brida had learned in her courses. The woman sat looking at them for a moment, said a few words in a strange language, then turned over just one of the cards. It was card number 23, a king of clubs. "Good protection," she said, "from a strong, powerful man with dark hair." Her boyfriend was neither strong nor powerful, and the Magus's hair was gray. "Don't think about his physical appearance," said Wicca, as if she had read her thoughts. "Think of your soulmate." "What do you mean, soulmate?" Brida was surprised. The woman inspired a strange respect, different from the respect she had felt for the Magus or for the bookseller. Wicca did not answer the question. She again shuffled the cards and again spread them in that same disorderly manner on the table, except that this time the cards were face up. The card in the middle of that apparent confusion was card number 11, a woman forcing open the mouth of a lion. Wicca picked up the card and asked Brida to hold it. Brida did so, although without knowing quite what was required of her. "In previous incarnations, your stronger side was always a woman," Wicca said. "What do you mean by soulmate?" Brida asked again. It was the first time she had challenged the woman, but it was, nonetheless, a very timid challenge. Wicca remained silent for a moment. A suspicion crossed her mind. For some reason, the Magus had not taught the girl about soulmates. "Nonsense," she said to herself, and brushed the thought aside. "The soulmate is the first thing people learn about when they want to follow the tradition of the moon," she said. "Only by understanding the soulmate can we understand how knowledge can be transmitted over time." As Wicca continued her explanation, Brida remained silent, feeling anxious. "We are eternal because we are all manifestations of God," Wicca said. "That is why we go through many lives and many deaths, emerging out of some unknown place and going toward another equally unknown place. You must get used to the fact that there are many things in magic which are not and never will be explained. God decided to do certain things in a certain way, and why he did this is a secret known only to him." The dark night of faith, thought Brida. So it existed in the tradition of the moon as well. The fact is that this happens, Wicca went on. And when people think of reincarnation, they always come up against a very difficult question. If, in the beginning, there were so few people on the face of Earth, and now there are so many, Where did all those new souls come from? Brida held her breath. She had asked herself this question many times. The answer is simple, said Wicca, after pausing to savor the young woman's eager silence. In certain reincarnations, we divide into two. Our souls divide as do crystals and stars, cells and plants. And does only one of those parts know who it is? Asked Brida. She had many questions to ask, but she wanted to ask them one at a time, and this seemed the most important. We form part of what the alchemists call the anima mundi, the soul of the world, said Wicca, without replying to the question. The truth is that if the anima mundi were merely to keep dividing, it would keep growing, but it would also become gradually weaker. That is why, as well as dividing into two, we also find ourselves. And that process of finding ourselves is called love. Because when a soul divides, it always divides into a male part and a female part. That's how the book of Genesis explains it. The soul of Adam was split in two, and Eve was born out of him. Wicca stopped suddenly and sat looking at the cards scattered on the table. There are many cards, she said, but they're all part of the same deck. In order to understand their message, we need them all. All are equally important. So it is with souls. Human beings are all interlinked, like the cards in this deck. In each life, we feel a mysterious obligation to find at least one of those soul mates. The greater love that separated them feels pleased with the love that brings them together again. But how will I know who my soul mate is? Brida felt that this was one of the most important questions she had ever asked in her life. Wicca laughed. She had already asked herself that question, and with the same eager anxiety as the young woman opposite her. You could tell your soulmate by the light in their eyes, and since time began, that has been how people have recognized their true love. The tradition of the moon used a different process, a kind of vision that showed a point of light above the left shoulder of your soulmate. But she wouldn't tell the girl that just yet. She might one day learn to see that point of light, or she might not. She would get her answer soon enough. By taking risks, she said to Brida. By risking failure, disappointment, disillusion, but never ceasing in your search for love. As long as you keep looking, you will triumph in the end. Brida remembered the Magus saying something similar when he spoke about the path of magic. Perhaps it's all the same thing, she thought. Wicca started picking up the cards from the table, and Brida sensed that her time was nearly up. Yet there was one other question to ask. Is it possible to meet more than one soulmate in each life? Yes, thought Wicca with a certain bitterness. And when that happens, the heart is divided, and the result is pain and suffering. Yes, we can meet 3 or 4 soulmates, because we are many, and we are scattered. The young woman was asking the right questions, but she had to avoid answering them. The essence of creation is one and one alone, she said. And that essence is called love. Love is the force that brings us back together, in order to condense the experience dispersed in many lives and many parts of the world. We are responsible for the whole earth because we do not know where they might be. Those soulmates we were from the beginning of time. If they are well, then we too will be happy. If they are not well, we will suffer, however unconsciously, a portion of their pain. Above all, though, we are responsible for re-encountering, at least once in every incarnation, the soulmate who is sure to cross our path. Even if it is only for a matter of moments, because those moments bring with them a love so intense that it justifies the rest of our days. The dog barked in the kitchen. Wicca finished picking up the cards and looked again at Brida. We can also allow our soulmate to pass us by without accepting him or her, or even noticing. Then we will need another incarnation in order to find that soulmate. And because of our selfishness, we will be condemned to the worst torture humankind ever invented for itself: loneliness. Wicca got up and showed Brida to the door. "You didn't come here to find out about your soulmate," she said before saying goodbye. "You have a gift, and once I know what that gift is, I might be able to teach you the tradition of the moon." Brida felt very special. She needed to feel this, for the woman inspired a respect she had felt for very few other people. "I'll do my best. I want to learn the tradition of the moon," she thought, because the tradition of the moon doesn't require you to spend the night alone in a dark forest. "Now listen to me," said Wicca sternly. "Every day from today, at an hour of your choosing, sit down alone at a table and spread the tarot deck as I did, completely at random. Don't try to understand anything. Simply study the cards. It will teach you all you need to know for the moment. It's like the tradition of the sun, me teaching myself again," thought Brida as she went down the stairs. And only when she was on the bus did she realize that the woman had spoken of a gift. But she could talk about that at their next meeting. For a whole week, Brida devoted half an hour a day to spreading the tarot cards on the table in the living room. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and set the alarm for 1 in the morning. She would get up, make a quick cup of coffee, and sit down to contemplate the cards, trying to decipher their hidden language. The first night, she was very excited. Brida was convinced that Wicca had taught her some kind of secret ritual, and so she tried to spread the cards in exactly the same way, expecting some occult message to be revealed. After half an hour, apart from a few minor visions, which she felt were merely the fruits of her imagination, nothing of any great note had happened. She did the same thing on the second night. Wicca had said that the cards would tell their own story, and to judge by the courses Brida had attended, it was a very ancient story indeed, dating back more than 3,000 years, to a time when mankind was closer to the original wisdom. The pictures seemed so simple, she thought. A woman forcing open the mouth of a lion, a cart pulled by 2 mysterious animals, a man sitting before a table covered with sundry objects. She had been taught that the deck was a book in which the divine wisdom had noted down the main changes that take place during our journey through life. But its author, knowing that humanity learned more easily from vice than from virtue, had arranged for this sacred book to be transmitted across the generations in the form of a game. The deck was an invention of the gods. It can't be that simple, thought Brida every time she spread the cards on the table. She had been taught complicated methods, elaborate systems, and those cards arranged in no particular order began to have a troubling effect on her reasoning. On the third night, she threw the cards down angrily on the floor. For a moment, she thought that this angry reaction might have some magical inspiration behind it, but the results were equally unsatisfactory, just a few indefinable intuitions, which again, she dismissed as mere imaginings. At the same time, the idea of her soulmate didn't leave her for a moment. At first, she felt as if she were going back to her adolescence, to dreams of an enchanted prince crossing mountains and valleys in search of his lady of the glass slipper, or in order to awaken a sleeping beauty with a kiss. Finding your soulmate is something that only happens in fairy tales, she told herself, half joking. Fairy tales had been her first experience of the magical universe that she was now so eager to enter, and more than once she had wondered why people ended up distancing themselves from that world, knowing the immense joy that childhood had brought to their lives. After spending a week obsessed with the idea of the soul mate, Brida became gripped by a terrifying feeling. What if she chose the wrong man? On the 8th night, when she woke again to carry out her vain contemplation of the tarot cards, she decided to invite her boyfriend out to supper the following night. She chose a fairly inexpensive restaurant because he always insisted on paying the bill. despite the fact that he earned far less as a research assistant to a physics professor at the university than she earned as a secretary. It was still summer, and they sat out at one of the tables on the pavement by the river. "I want to know when the spirits are going to let me sleep with you again," said Lawrence good-humoredly. Brida looked at him tenderly. She had asked him not to come to her apartment for 2 weeks, and he had agreed, protesting just warmly enough for her to know how much he loved her. In his way, he too was seeking to understand the mysteries of the universe, and if one day he were to ask her to stay away from him for 2 weeks, she would have to say yes. They dined unhurriedly and largely in silence, watching the boats crossing the river and the people walking past on the pavement. The bottle of white wine on the table was emptied and replaced by another. Half an hour later, they had pushed their 2 chairs together and were sitting, arms around each other, gazing up at the starry summer sky. "Just look at that sky," said Lawrence, stroking her hair. "What we're looking at now is how the sky would have appeared thousands of years ago." He had told her the same thing on the day they first met, but Brida chose not to interrupt him. This was his way of sharing his world with her. Many of those stars have already died, and yet their light still fills the universe. Other stars were born far away, and their light has not yet reached us. So no one knows what the real sky looks like. She had asked that same question on their first meeting, too, but it was good to repeat such delicious moments. "We don't know. We study what we can see, but what we see is not always what exists. I want to ask you something. What are we made of? Where did the atoms that make up our bodies come from?" Lawrence looked up at the ancient sky and said, "They were created along with these stars and this river, in the first second of the universe's existence. So after that first moment of creation, nothing more was added. No, nothing. Everything moved and continues to move. Everything was transformed and continues to be transformed. But all the matter that exists in the universe now is the same matter from all those billions of years ago, and not so much as a single atom has been added." Brida sat studying the movement of both river and stars. It was easy to see the river flowing across the earth, but it was hard to see the stars moving in the sky. And yet both were moving. "Lawrence," she said at last, after a long silence during which they both watched a boat passing, "let me ask what might seem an absurd question. Is it physically possible that the atoms that make up my body could have been in the body of someone who lived before me?" Lawrence stared at her in amazement. "What do you mean?" "What I said. Is such a thing possible? They could be in plants or insects, or they could have turned into helium molecules and be out there somewhere, millions of miles from Earth. But is it possible that the atoms that made up the body of someone who died could be in my body and in someone else's body?" He said nothing for a moment, then said, "Yes, it is." The sound of distant music reached them. It came from a barge crossing the river, and even from far away, Brida could make out the silhouette of a sailor framed in a lighted window. It was a tune that reminded her of her adolescence. It brought back memories of school dances, the smell of her bedroom, the color of the ribbon she would use to tie up her ponytail. Brida realized that Lawrence had never before considered the question she had asked him, and was, perhaps at that moment, wondering if his own body contained the atoms of Viking warriors, of volcanic explosions, or of prehistoric animals that had mysteriously disappeared. But her thoughts were elsewhere. All she wanted to know was this: had the man so tenderly embracing her once been part of herself? The barge came closer, and the music began to fill the air around them. Conversations at the other table stopped too, everyone eager to find out where the sound was coming from, because everyone had once been an adolescent, attended school dances, and had dreams full of stories about warriors and fairies. "I love you, Lawrence." and Brida hoped against hope that this young man who knew so much about the light from the stars contained a little of the person she had once been. "It's no good, I can't do it." Brida sat up in bed and felt for the packet of cigarettes on the bedside table. Going against all her normal habits, she decided to smoke a cigarette before breakfast. It was another 2 days until she was due to meet Wicca again. She knew that, during the last 2 weeks, she had tried her hardest. She had channeled all her hopes into the method of spreading the cards taught to her by that attractive and mysterious woman, and she had struggled hard not to disappoint her, but the cards refused to reveal their secrets. Each time the previous 3 nights when she had finished the exercise, she had felt like crying. She felt vulnerable and alone, and had a sense that a great opportunity was slipping through her fingers. Once again, she felt that life was not treating her as it treated other people. It gave her every chance to achieve something, and just when she was close to her objective, the ground opened up and swallowed her. That's how it had been with her studies, with certain boyfriends, with certain dreams she had never shared with anyone. She thought of the Magus. Perhaps he could help her. But she had promised herself that she would only go back to folk when she knew enough about magic to face him again. And now it seemed that this would never happen. She lay for a long time in bed before deciding to get up and make breakfast. Finally, she screwed up the necessary resolve and courage to face another day, one more of her daily dark nights, as she had taken to calling them since her experience in the forest. She prepared some coffee, looked at her watch, and saw that she still had enough time. She went over to the shelf and searched among the books for the piece of paper the bookseller had given her. To console herself, she thought, there are other paths. She had met the Magus, she had met Wicca, and she would, in the end, meet the person who could teach her in a way that she could understand. But she knew this was merely an excuse. "I'm always starting things and then giving up," she thought rather surlily. Perhaps life would soon realize this and stop presenting her with the same opportunities over and over. Or perhaps, by always giving up when she had only just started, she had exhausted all possible paths without even taking a single step. But that was how she was, and she felt herself grow gradually weaker and less able to change. A few years before, she would have felt depressed by her own behavior, but she would at least still have been capable of the occasional heroic gesture. Now, though, she was starting to adapt to her own mistakes. She knew other people who did the same. They, too, got used to their mistakes, and it wasn't long before they began to see them as virtues. And by then it was too late. She considered not phoning Wicca and simply disappearing. But what about the bookshop? She wouldn't then have the courage to go there again. If she just disappeared, the bookseller would not be so kind next time. It's happened before. Because of some thoughtless gesture toward one person, I've ended up losing touch with other people I really cared about. She couldn't do the same thing now. She was on a path where valuable contacts were very hard to find. She steeled herself and dialed the number on the piece of paper. Wicca answered. "I won't be able to come tomorrow," said Brida. "No, the plumber can't make it either," replied Wicca. For a moment, Brida had no idea what the woman was talking about. Then Wicca started complaining about some problem with her kitchen sink and how she'd arranged several times for a man to come and fix it, but he never came. She launched into a long story about old buildings, which might look terribly imposing, but which were, of course, beset by all kinds of problems. Then, in the middle of her story about the plumber, Wicca suddenly asked, "Have you got your tarot cards handy?" Surprised, Brida said that she did. Wicca asked her to spread the cards on the table, because she was going to teach her a method of finding out whether the plumber would or would not turn up the following day.